given everyone the ability. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Burning Platforms. Before we get started, I may or may not have given everyone the right to unmute themselves and talk, and that would be quite unfortunate while we're recording. So if everyone could please just keep themselves on mute, that would be fantastic. I am still very much learner wheels on running this whole thing for myself. But hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Burning Platforms. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm the director of the Centre for Responsible Technology at the Australia Institute. And this is our fortnightly forum where we just kick around ideas about the politics of technology with our regular little crew. Some of you have been coming for a couple of years now, and it's great to see you all here. Lizzie and Dan, our regulars, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch, Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia. It's a big day today. It's the anniversary of Facebook's takedown of the Australian news services a year ago today, which feels like a decade. And we're going to be diving deep into that with Professor Terry Flew from Sydney Uni in the second half of this session. Before I get started, though, I do want to acknowledge that we're all on Indigenous land. I'm on Gadigal land up here in Sydney, and I'm sure you will join me in recognising this land was never ceded and paying respects to elders past, present and emerging. So a big milestone in probably the moment where Australia was at the centre of the world's attention on technology this time a year ago. And I think the catalyst for that particular showdown, we all have slightly different perspectives on, and we've been always very happy, but very polite as well in teasing out those differences. So we'll be doing that in the second half when we talk about what we've learned over the last 12 months, whether the bargaining code has delivered on its promise, and whether that should be the model for the rest of the world in resolving the contradictions between the business models of the media companies and the big tech platforms. I know quite a number of you have, your own views in the chat, and I really encourage you all to sort of let us know what you've thought about it as well. Hi, Dylan. I know you'll have a crack, and always welcome to hear what you think about how things are panning out. So before we get stuck into that, those of you that have been coming will know that we run the first half of the session where Lizzie, Dan and I just hone in on a particular story or a particular issue that's caught our eye over the last couple of weeks, and then we dive in deep. So I don't know, we might have to start a bit of a scissors, rock, paper on who leads it off, but I reckon today, Lizzie, you kick us off. Labor announced a policy on tech over the last fortnight. Now, the Liberals have had a lot of running on tech policy and sort of the regulation of big tech. So what was Labor's counterpoint? The headline called it a digital license for kids. And I can't help thinking about driver's licenses or gun licenses but what is a digital license, and is it a good policy or is it just an announceable?
It's called an eSmart Digital License Plus, which I think is a bit of a pastiche of various almost Web 3.0 terminology there, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, this copped quite a bit of mocking on social media. It felt a little bit like it was proposed by Principal Skinner or similar, talking about a pen license. Did either of you guys ever have a pen license?
No.
Oh, really? I definitely got my pen license, but I think, to be honest, if anyone saw my handwriting these days, I'd be stripped.
So what was a pen license once you were legible? Because I've never been legible. I ended up learning shorthand and my writing went.
Yeah, okay, I take it back. Maybe you didn't get your pen license for a reason, but in general, the idea was that you would transition from a grey lead to a pen because you'd mastered kind of cursive text. But yeah, my handwriting these days is appalling. But the whole idea, I think I got it when I was in grade 4. The idea was that you worked for it and then you got it, and it was a sign that you were moving up in the world. And so Labor has put out this press release that kind of framed it in those terms. What they're actually talking about is essentially making a digital media literacy program that's available in some schools in Australia now with the Alana and Madeline Foundation, which has got a focus on anti-bullying, particularly in cyberspace. They're proposing to make that universal if they win the election, so available in all schools, which to my mind seems pretty sensible. I'm certainly not opposed to giving children access to education about digital media literacy. I think it's an important thing to do. I think it's a bit of a daggy name, and that's fine, but whatever. It's not just an announceable, although I wish they'd get better at the announceable bit. The thing I wanted to raise, I suppose, in the context of this discussion is the conversation that we're having about online safety has definitely been dominated by the LNP Scott Morrison government. They've passed a whole bunch of legislation. They've got legislation proposed as well, like the Identify and Disrupt Act last year, which was focused on surveillance agencies, talked about the need to protect children from online predators. The Online Safety Act obviously included a huge range of powers for the e-safety commissioner. And also we've got a couple of bills currently before Parliament. There's been an inquiry into social media and the safety of people who use social media. And I feel like this discussion has been really dominated by kind of moralism and policing as the answer to problems of online safety. So in that way, I really wanted to encourage a potential Labor government to look to literacy and education and empowerment as an alternative to that narrative around online safety. And I guess the other point I'd make, and I've got a piece I wrote about this, which I'll link to in the chat, is, if it hasn't already been, was just also that I think it's fine to talk about literacy and education, particularly for media with children, but we've got to make it more expansive than that, because technology touches all different aspects of our lives. And the government's commitment has to be more expansive than that, including implementing some of the recommendations in the privacy review discussion paper, for example, so that the Labor government, if it gets elected, is not just going to be talking about and educating kids about their rights online or how to engage online safely, but are actually contributing to legislative action to make those spaces safer and more accountable. And management of data is a really obvious example. If we can limit how much companies surveil, particularly young people, but children as well, I think that does contribute to online safety. So that's kind of what we were getting at when we were writing about this topic. I want to be encouraging, and I think they should do more, even if it's got a slightly daggy name.
Yeah, I must say that when I saw it, I reached out to Tim Watts, who was our guest a fortnight ago, with a bit of a WTF. And he came back and said, this is actually one of the recommendations of the ACCC digital platforms inquiry, and I've been whinging that they've only moved forward on the News Media Bargaining Code and not the rest of the recommendations. But if you go back and look at what Sims was saying about digital literacy, it was more expansive than just teaching kids like stranger danger. It's actually that if you are going to have people growing up in these ecosystems, that they're actually aware of the way they operate. So not so much just who to say no to, but a bit of a roadmap of how they work. And obviously you're not going to make a 9-year-old read Susanna Zuboff, but you've got to find a way of making them aware that they are also a subject of a particular business model that will exploit them if they don't know what they're doing.
Totally. That's why I think technology literacy can't just also be about media and consuming media. It needs to be how it fits into other ecosystems of our lives, including basics of how tech works, like how software and hardware interact with each other. Like, it's very difficult to understand some of the power dynamics of the public debates we have about the regulation of technology without a basic understanding of that. And this is the time to be teaching them. I'm not from the school that all kids need to learn to code or anything like that, but I think we shouldn't just be confining it to media, and we probably need to think a bit more carefully about that. And there's also like ways in which it can be made fun. Like, it doesn't have to be totally boring and dull. There's lots of people who work in the space on like the gamification of digital, of technology literacy and the like. And I think it's worth drawing on them. I mean, I think I haven't gone through the digital literacy program from Alana and Madeline Foundation. From all reports, it seems like a very sensible one, and they're doing the right thing. And so I want to encourage them on that. But, this is the time to be bold, I reckon, and start thinking about how we can do it really well.
Dan, you've got kids. Are they going to get a license? I'll bring you in a sec, Terry, but just from Dan first. Yeah.
Look, I think I'm just going to be in unison with both of you on this. I mean, I think it's actually a really good thing. I agree it needs to be more expansive. I think Travis in the chat just mentioned that we also need to be thinking about the Internet of Things and all the surveillance that comes with that. And I think giving kids some understanding of these things early is absolutely fundamental. I mean, I can't think of how many times that I've had a conversation with my friends who are maybe just Generation X, if not Generation Y. Pete, I know you're a little bit older than me and Lizzie, but the point made is, you know, thank Christ that social media wasn't around when we were young and stupid in our teens and early 20s. And there hasn't really been an education done in any formal way. You're kind of relying on parents to educate their kids, and you're often relying on parents to educate them who also come from a position of ignorance. So I agree. I think that social media is one part of this. Privacy is another really important part of this. And just an understanding, to your point, Lizzie, just an understanding of the increasingly dominant role that coding and software is playing in our society, I think would give everyone a really good basis to be able to determine how they operate in this new digital world. So I think this is a great initiative. I was also going to make the point, this was one of Rod Sims' recommendations. Let's hope that that Labor keeps on, and the coalition for that matter, keeps on picking up all of these recommendations and acting on them.
Yeah, Terry, shoot, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone. Your comments there about not making 6-year-olds read Shoshana Zuboff reminded me that I took her magnum opus to the US with me when I was on leave in 2019 when we were able to travel, and every night I'd say, well, I'm going to read some of the big book of Zuboff before going to bed, and just about every night I ended up closing it and
3 pages.
Just going straight to bed. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. So get your point there. A couple of things on this I thought were perhaps worth mentioning over and above whether it's a good or a bad thing. One is that it does connect to debates that are happening in other parts of the world for sure, and anyone who's been following the UK debates would know that this online safety issue has been going back and forth in the UK for a number of years. And one of the issues that arises with this and a lot of other areas is the question of, if there is to be some form of regulation, who should do it? And there's authors such as Philip Schlesinger at the University of Glasgow and others have been talking about this idea of neo-regulation, that because a lot of the issues that arise in this space don't sit neatly within any single department or agency, there's a lot of moving around and indeed a lot of competition among governmental agencies around who should be responsible. I'll put a link in the chat to that. But I think about that in Australia with the rise of the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner. And I think Julie Inman-Grant is a very interesting example of a policy entrepreneur in this space who has managed to very effectively get the ear of the minister. And I think an interesting point about that, and I have heard Paul Fletcher actually say this, is that one of the reasons the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner has been promoted was the sense that the ACMA, the Communications and Media Authority, wasn't doing anything. And I think, that we're possibly at the end of a 3-decade era of what came to be known as responsive regulation or sometimes self-regulation or whatever, where the government agencies basically set up a framework for the industries to regulate themselves. And that's, we've got ample evidence of this failing in other sectors, most notably finance. And in this space, it seems policy entrepreneurs, if you like, such as the E-Safety Commissioner, have acquired quite a degree of power and influence with regards to policy. I think Rod Sims, as chair of the ACCC, is another policy entrepreneur in this space that, we'll talk about the ACCC later, but, I always thought of it as being about, determining whether you were being ripped off for parking at the airport, those kinds of, very traditional competition policy issues. But, Sims with the digital platforms inquiry took this into some quite different spaces, including...
Yeah, we will go a bit more deep into our friends at the ACCC in the second part of this discussion, but just moving through the week or the fortnight that was, Dan, you've nominated an initiative around privacy that Google's released over the last couple of weeks, which is putting in place levels of privacy that might constrain other companies doing what they do best.
Yeah, so this is the privacy sandbox on Android is the title that Google has given this, and this is effectively Google's version of Apple's app transparency or app tracking transparency (ATT) that they released as part of iOS 14.5, and effectively what ATT did and what I think Google is proposing to do. It's a little bit sketchy at this stage because it's still a couple of years away, but what they're proposing to do, I think, is limiting third-party use, so publishers, Facebook, whoever, from being able to access the device ID and therefore track consumers across all of the apps that they use on Android devices, and similar to what's happened with Apple. Now, a couple of points on this. I mean, look, that is a welcome step. I mean, it's kind of following the same principles that we're seeing with the end of cookies in the browser and not being able to follow people across the internet that way. So it's welcome. But just a couple of points, which I think often gets lost a little bit in this debate, is Apple was in the position to be able to do this and position it very much as being about protecting consumer privacy, because at the time that they announced this, they didn't really have an advertising business. They did have some, by the way, I'll come back to that. But, I think we can probably think it is relatively genuine that Apple were doing this to protect consumer privacy. The difference is that Google is doing this at a time when they are the largest advertising business in the world. And the impact of this, while it will be good for consumers in one sense, it's terribly bad for competition, because what it basically means is that third parties, such as Facebook, but not just Facebook, publishers such as The Guardian and everyone else, will no longer be able to track users as effectively as they previously could for the purposes of creating segments, for the purposes of target advertising. But Google, as the owner of the operating system, can still collect all of that data on the basis that it's first party and they own it. And that will give them a huge advantage in their targeted advertising capabilities, similar to what we're going to see when cookies go away from Chrome. And so I think, just to give a sense of what the risk is for this, if you look at what's happened to Apple, so Apple, the only advertising business that Apple runs is their effectively Apple search ads, which are the sponsored ads that you see in the App Store around downloading apps. In the 6 months or so that it's been since ATT was introduced, that business has tripled in its revenue, according to many media reports. Now, if something similar was to happen to Google, then, I mean, help the rest of us, because we're gonna struggle even more than we do in competing against a juggernaut like that. So this is why, I'll finish my monologue now. This is why, while this is a welcome step, it must come with the government stepping in and introducing purpose limitations on what you can do with the collection and use of consumer data. Because if we don't have some guardrails on companies like Google, but also Apple and others, from being able to collect data from one use and use it for something else, namely targeted advertising, then it's going to create the competition issues we see now so much worse.
So purpose limitations is your hobby horse, Dan. Do you want to just explain at one more level of detail and where that discussion is up to at the moment?
Yeah, so just to explain what I mean by purpose limitations, it's certainly not my concept. It's something which was introduced actually as part of GDPR, not really enforced well, in my view, yet, but watch this space. And effectively what that means is, to give an example, someone like Google, for example, can't take the data that they extract from your use of Google Maps and use that for the purposes of selling targeted advertising in a completely different environment. I don't think any consumer would think that that was a reasonable use of consumer data, and it wouldn't be what they would expect to have happen. So you put purpose limitations in place that say whatever data you use for the purposes of running Google Maps must be used for the purposes of improving Google Maps and nothing else. And if you do that, it substantially reduces the surveillance and the capability of the advertising businesses that Google has built. So hopefully that explains it.
Yeah, Lizzie, Unity ticket there with Dan on purpose limitations.
Yeah. Look, I certainly wouldn't object to being introduced as part of the review of the Privacy Act. I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I do. It's hard. It's sometimes hard to feel a bit sorry for the losers in the fallout of a situation like this, who are sad about losing access to rich behavioural data, I suppose. And that's the only thing I'd say about that, but that's perhaps a bit cynical and mean. I mean, one of the things that it does strike me is that probably, Dan, this would see a company like The Guardian shift away from behavioural advertising towards native advertising. I'm not sure if that's something that you guys talk about a lot, but it always struck me as a bit odd that media companies we're interested, I mean, this is preempting another discussion, but we're interested in getting into bed with social media companies when in fact the data that they have about their users could be used to sell advertising in the way that they used to, perhaps when they were actually hard copy papers. And there's a lot to be said, I think, for preferring native advertising if you have to tolerate advertising over, provided that it's disclosed and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to, say, using behavioural information. So, I mean, that's the other thing to keep in mind. I would just put in that I'm less sympathetic to Apple than perhaps you are, Dan, because Apple's got the most locked up environment for people to be able to use their products. It's like a subscription service from hell. You know, once you've got an Apple product, it's really hard to move out of that domain, and they make it that way for a reason. And they, you know, they obviously have other ways in which they crack down on potential competition. You know, Epic and Apple are in a massive dispute now in Australia about this issue, you know, charging through the App Store. So they've got their own streams of revenue that are protected by that. So I'm perhaps a little more cynical about their privacy play there. But
I'm not sure if you are more cynical. I just haven't spoken about that. I am 100% with you on that. As someone that has to give away 30% of our revenue to Apple for anyone that subscribes to The Guardian in iOS. I mean, that is a blatant rent seeking. It needs to be reduced.
It's the reason it's the most valuable company in the world. Yeah, so, you know, I think when large tech companies that have profited from a data extractive business models now talk about privacy, we should always hold them in suspicion. But yeah, I do think it is interesting that we are shifting and actually it feels like we're in a new phase of these companies' growth where they're less about, you know, giving away free services to acquire stuff and now concentrating their pipelines of data flows and leveraging that as their value add to people seeking to buy advertising space. So it is a different phase in some of these tech platforms' growth and it's interesting to observe.
Yeah. I might just bowl up my one, which was really about the metaverse because, you know, it's my favorite crazy idea.
Lizzie's too. She loves it.
And people should know that there has been an edict from Mark Zuckerberg that his workers are now metamates. They had to do it. But the story that caught my eye, it originally came from my second favorite tech podcast, which is What Next TBD, which is a fantastic podcast that Slate puts out, which was around safety in the metaverse, which was really, there's been a spate of complaints of sexual harassment in the metaverse, virtual groping, kids running rampant from room to room, even though there's meant to be age limitations on access. Obviously, they've just got their parents' Oculus. And it has got me thinking, what are going to be the rules of moderation in a place which is, you know, potentially Westworld, where you can just go in and be your worst self with very little consequence. And, you know, the way I've always thought of how we should think of platform activity is you have norms, you have rules, and then you have the external laws of the land. But when you're setting up a new environment where there are no norms, then how does that interplay with the rules and the law of the land? Like, it appears that people are being sexually assaulted, so laws are being committed already in what's still basically a beta product. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate ran a study, and they discovered 100 potential violations of Meta's own policies for virtual reality in the space of 11 hours of recording people's conduct in the app. So again, our guest 2 weeks ago, Tim Watts, had said that he'd actually purchased Oculus to see what's going on. I'm wondering if we need to all get ourselves an Oculus and go in there and do a burning platforms from inside, Lizzie, because I'm still trying to get my head around how you actually create an environment with rules and norms from the ground up. And I don't know if that's even a question, but I just said, hey, this is getting weirder by the week.
Yeah, this is so funny because I understand your concentric circles there, but I would also put design decisions as being, I guess, a way in which norms might be able to be developed, or the absence of any consideration of this from a design perspective suggests that there are a set of norms there that just perhaps haven't been critiqued or questioned.
Just unpack that. So you designed that you're going to have a tactile experience, and then you'll have no places where you cannot have a tactile experience, or
No places. I like this. You should be working for the e-safety commissioner. Well, it's interesting because when you raised this story and we were talking about it, it did come to mind to me a number of different stories of people who've been involved in video gaming where they've been groped or sexually assaulted. There's a interesting Medium post from someone who talks about trying out a VR headset in 2016, I think, and someone comes up to her and starts groping her. And she said it felt really violating, which I can understand, but also like her brother and her husband were watching at the time this experience. Like the whole thing is just awful. They weren't not doing anything about it, but they're observing her play the game in the headset, and you feel humiliated. I can imagine it's just awful. And I thought that was a really interesting observation because it hadn't occurred to me that this kind of thing would happen, perhaps naively. So it is a problem that's been occurring in multiplayer video games for quite some time, and there are people who are studying this and are trying to come up with, for example, design solutions to this problem, how you cultivate norms whereby this kind of behavior is called out, where people get put into timeouts, where you can, what one set of developers came up with is what's called a power gesture. It's like having a superpower where you can create a personal bubble around yourself so that people can't touch you. So if you're in one of these haptic vests where you can experience sensations when other avatars touch you and the like, you should be able to turn that off pretty quickly and easily, I would have thought, as a first port of call. And you should be able to report really easily when someone's being gross. You should have, ways in which you foster a culture of reporting and calling out this kind of behavior, making it very easy for other people and bystanders to do it too. And this is the kind of research that's already been happening in video games. And that's why I think, Zuckerberg can't really let this lie. It's going to be a massive liability for him because I would not go on there. I have to tell you, in this kind of environment, I do not want to be.
We had a class action lawyer around. We could get in there early. Preemptive? Okay. Is there a principle here?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's one. I guess I think it like a lawyer because that's what I am. But if you've got a bunch of research and a bunch of possible design tools available to you, and you choose not to implement them, and you expose your users to that risk of harm that's unacceptable, and people go on to experience that harm, you do have to wonder if you've got a duty of care to those people by allowing them into a space that you regulate, that you design, and then not doing the things you need to do to keep them safe. There's a real question around whether they owe a duty of care to guard against this kind of thing. And, as a lawyer, a hammer that sees everything as a nail, I would say they do. And a failure to do so is not just a legal risk. It's also, I just think, a risk to the product's success. Like, women see this and don't want to go in there. That's my opinion. I wouldn't really want to go in there. So Peter and Dan, if you want to go in there and hang out with a bunch of bros who love, fighting each other, doing bro things, I don't know, then be my guest. But I think I'd rather be somewhere else. Or maybe there'll be women only spaces or
the ladies' lounge.
Yeah.
I love it how quickly that you lump us in with the tech pros at any opportunity, Lizzie. It doesn't seem fair to me at all. It's funny though how you see everything in the world through a legal lens, and as a commercial sort of business guy, I see everything through a competition lens. You know what I would like to see? I would like to see companies other than Meta, Facebook, spending the quantum of money that they are, so that we have more than just one company effectively likely to dominate this new world. Because at the moment, they spent $10 billion on this last year. Now, I know that obviously Microsoft, Apple, Google are all investing in this space, but not to the same level in terms of controlling the experiences that Facebook is or Meta is. And so I think one of the solutions to this is hopefully that we have more people investing in this space rather than just one company.
Doesn't that create the virtual reality, Dan? Isn't that just accepting that this is the next frontier? Like, why does this have to be the next frontier?
No, but my point is that I don't think it's inevitable that it is the next frontier, by the way. But my point is that if there was competition in this space, where privacy was something that people competed on in a way that we haven't seen with social media as sort of a parallel, then hopefully we would see some of the things such as what Lizzie is describing being developed from the start. And hopefully that would create safer spaces which these companies could compete on. And so you might have companies which would go, well, I've created our version of the metaverse, whatever the hell you want to call it, which is safe for women, and women might be more inclined to go there. But to answer your question, Peter, I'm not convinced that people want to spend lots of time in this space yet. I know that there's lots of talk about this being the next computing platform and it taking over from where the iPhone left off. I can't see all of us wanting to wear these things on our face for any more than, I don't know, a minute a day, if that. So I'm unconvinced.
Have you got a virtual opinion on this one, Terry?
Oh, I think not so much. I agree with Dan about the not wanting to wear these things on your face, but I think we are going to see increasingly mixed realities in the workplace. I think, as someone who works in a university where I can tell you there is now incredible confusion about whether people are doing classes face-to-face or online, that COVID has just blown up something that was always potentially there, that the distinction between, in class and online and so on is absolutely changing very quickly. And I think this is increasingly people's work environments as well. And I can see innovations in the mixed reality space playing quite an important role here, that I don't know that, a decade from now we will be doing events such as this in the format in which we currently
Although I like to think this is our little mini metaverse, in that I do think there is a sense that this technology, we are meeting together in a virtual space in a way that's different to just sharing a post on Facebook or watching a pre-broadcast or even listening to a podcast, that we're actually in this space at the one time. People are actively contributing. So it's just whether you need to go the next level down of a more intimate experience where we can feel and touch each other, which is just like,
I wouldn't mind checking out what that haircut looks like from the back, I have to say, Peter.
When I get to man bun, I'll let you know. So let's dive deep on that note, and thank you, Lizzie. It is a year since Facebook hit the switch in the middle of the negotiations over the news media bargaining code, and probably hit it a little bit harder than they actually intended, so that we woke up a year ago and all news sites had their pages on Facebook blocked, but also a large number of civil society sites, the domestic violence hotline, Weather Bureau, and it was a big deal. Like, it was the largest platform in the world, blocking access of effectively Australian news sites and civil society from their platform. And there were negotiations. It was all over the news media bargaining code, which, in some iteration landed in a way that has created a whole bunch of deals in the media, which we're not quite sure what the substance is, because they're all commercial in confidence. But you look at a place like The Guardian, they're holding a lot more journalists. So I guess the discussion for the second half of this session is not so much what Facebook did, but whether the bargaining code is a framework that has succeeded, whether it's the right way of approaching the contradictions between traditional media and social media. So I want to bring Terry in very soon, but I know we've all got different views on this, and I just want to get each of you to reflect whether your views have changed over the last 12 months and where you have landed with this particular piece of social policy. So I'll start with you, Dan, because you've been closer to it. And I know there's some things you can say and some things you can't say. But what's your take? Is it what you thought it would deliver, and how has it affected your business?
Sure. Look, there's so much you can say here. I'll try and keep this brief. Look, I am a massive fan of the News Media Bargaining Code. I have been a massive fan of it for a long time. Obviously, there's differing views on this, and we'll no doubt get into those. But just a couple of points I would say as to why I'm a fan of it. I concede the point, which I think you've made before, Lizzie, that it is not, if you were starting from scratch and trying to regulate the platforms, you wouldn't necessarily go down the News Media Bargaining Code route. There's some kind of perhaps digital tax, which is then redistributed to news publishers, would make sense in a lot of ways. The problem is that probably runs foul of free trade agreements, and I'm not sure that it's actually going to be something which we could actually get up. So I regard the News Media Bargaining Code as a pragmatic solution to dealing with the dominance of Google and Facebook on the digital advertising market. And the other point I would make is it's important to look at this in the context of what has it done for public interest journalism. And from the Guardian's point of view, at least, look, we have massively increased the size of our newsroom as a result of these agreements. To be clear, we were growing anyway and going well, but what it has done is it's brought forward the investment that we probably would have made over the next sort of 2 or 3 years into a year and really accelerated our growth. And that's made us more able to compete with Nine and News Corp and others in a way that we couldn't previously, because we were relatively small and still are, but less so now. So look, I remain a big fan of it. I think we've also seen News Corp and Nine hiring more journalists and not announcing any redundancies. So I think, to your point, Peter, we don't know the full extent of the success of this, but I think we can assume that it has at least strengthened the companies which employ most of the journalists. The downside, obviously, is that Google and Facebook have not been designated under the legislation, and therefore they still have the ability to be able to pick winners with regards to who they do deals with. And what has been disappointing is that Facebook in particular, not so much Google because they've done a lot of smaller deals, but Facebook in particular has not done as many deals with smaller publishers as I would have liked to have seen. I still think, though, on balance, when you look at it, this has employed and no doubt saved hundreds of journalists' jobs in Australia, and that is good for Australian democracy. So I remain a very big fan of the code and what it's achieved.
What about you, Lizzie? Like, I know where your starting point was. Has your view changed in any way, or are you pretty much where you were 12 months ago?
No, I think I'm pretty much where I was.
Pretty consistent, aren't you?
I mean, yeah, it is pretty disappointing, but not surprising that there hasn't been a deal done with The Conversation or SBS. It's not surprising to me that none of the moves have been made to designate any of these platforms, notwithstanding that. I think it is good that the ABC is going to invest the revenue that they're obtaining from this into regional journalism because it's sorely needed. But I think it is pretty depressing that we've seen no new funding of the ABC, just to relax on the freeze on the indexation of their funding. And I am a bit concerned that this maybe justifies perhaps refusing to up that funding. I mean, more generally, I'm a bit alarmed that it's being potentially discussed in lots of other parts of the world, exactly as I thought it might be, rather than perhaps looking to more superior alternatives to policymaking in this space. And I am overwhelmingly worried about the power of Murdoch media in Australia, just because we have one of the most concentrated media landscapes in the world. And I'm pretty worried we're looking at the foundations being laid for, Fox News-ification of Australia, particularly as Sky News uses these resources to reach out into regional spaces, to reach out into other niche areas. I think it's really telling that that at various points in which YouTube videos from Sky News were being taken down for being disinformation or misinformation based on climate change denialism, they were also launching a journalism operation, a journalism initiative off the back of this code with in partnership with various other organisations. So I do think there's a problem whereby some of the worst aspects of the media are going to be boosted, and the kind of content we see is not quality content, but social media optimized content. But yeah, none of that's new.
I guess if I've just put up a piece on The Guardian, I think I've moved in one regard, in that I don't think such an important piece of reform that was designed to actually have a process where we could really come to an accommodation of the value of public interest journalism has ended up occurring behind closed doors. And the fact that the deal for Facebook turning back on after they dropped was to not be designated and go off and do deals on their own terms has actually undermined the integrity of what I thought at the time was a really good part of a broader package of reforms based on the ACCC report. And there's just two things I want to point to. The first is that under the law, the competition, ACMA, the media, has the right to say whether or not an organisation is carrying out public interest journalism. And if there was a designated platform, they would have to reach an accommodation. There's about 20 organisations that have passed through the ACMA hoop that Facebook and Google are saying talk to the hand to, and there's no mechanism unless the government wants to go down another showdown on designation. So for smaller media companies, there is this massive problem. And the second one, I know Dan can't be public about this, but I want to know what the deal is. So the concern I had was once Google and Facebook had to pay for news, they'd make sure that they got something out of it so that they'd be using news a bit as you were saying, Lizzie, for their purposes. And I am still concerned that we don't know the terms of those agreements. So I don't know if you can assure.
Can I respond to that in some way?
And
Sorry.
I don't regret backing in the code, because I do want to see more journalists working at The Guardian and News and Fairfax for that matter, because I also think that we need a strong media, but I am concerned that it's all happened behind the cloak of commercial incompetence.
So just on that last point, Peter, I'm glad you're still supportive, by the way. Lizzie hasn't beaten you down, so that's there's still hope. I'm like
the blow in the wind.
But look, as you said, I can't go into the specifics of the agreement because they are commercial in confidence, and neither can any of the media organisations that have done deals in Australia. At least that's my understanding. But I can say this, and I think it's an important point. The majority of the revenue that we are getting from Google and Facebook is for the licensing of our content. And let's not forget, yes, there is a public interest journalism benefit from this, but really, one of the things that gets lost a little bit in this debate is that Google and Facebook were getting a substantial benefit from our content that they were not paying for. And now they are, not to the extent that perhaps all of us would have liked, and not in exactly the way that they would have liked, but certainly the vast majority of the deal that we have done with them, and I suspect other media organisations have done with them, is licensing revenue, which doesn't come with strings attached. And so, look, these companies, as pointed out by Rod Sims in the Digital Platforms Report, are so-called unavoidable trading partners for us. It doesn't make us any more dependent on Google or Facebook than we were before. We were already dependent on Google and Facebook. If you want to have a digital business and you want to be able to reach an audience, you cannot do anything but make your content available on Google and Facebook. I wish that were not the case, and we're all striving to form direct relationships with our audiences. It's been a major focus of us for the whole time that I've been working in digital media, which is close to 20 years. But it doesn't change the dynamics of the fact that most people start their internet session with Google or Facebook, and therefore to not be there means that you're missing out on a huge amount of audience and benefit. So it's right for the benefit that it does for journalism, but it's also right just because Google and Facebook got a benefit that they should pay for, and now they are.
Terry, I'll bring you in here now. What's your reflection on what's gone on here in the broader context of the global conundrum of the decline of traditional journalism and the rise of social media?
Sure, thanks, Peter. I mean, from a personal point of view, I experienced a change that went in the other direction. That I was initially saying, well, nothing needed to be done, and disclosure. I contributed a consultant's report to Facebook along those lines, and then changed my mind. And I think part of the changing my mind, being persuaded by the likes of Peter and others, was the growing realisation that insofar as two things. One, insofar as green shoots were emerging in the online news space, they were really in danger of being killed by the platforms themselves. And Facebook's changes to its algorithm in 2018 had a massive impact on, the BuzzFeeds of the world and so forth. And secondly, just the whole question of who pays for news going forward is, I think, a really, really serious one. And I'll just bracket off the public service media for one moment and focus on commercial media. That we're coming to a pivot point where a century-long capacity to rely on the dual media markets is now under substantial threat. I think, the most telling parts of the ACCC inquiry are those around digital advertising now being at least 50% of all advertising revenue, and at least 70% of that going to Google and Facebook. So the idea that you can have news production taking place that can be reliably funded by advertising is coming to an end. And that raises a question: if you are to maintain news, and of course news is a complicated bundle of things, it's not all the same product, but someone's going to pay for that production. We can go to subscription models, and the New York Times has, for instance, done that very successfully. But we have to be aware that the New York Times's subscriber base is a very particular subset of the US population. Very few other mastheads have been able to follow the New York Times or Washington Post models. We can look to government to cross-subsidise news, but I think that's, and there are a variety of schemes around that, but we know some of the questions that arise around the government putting money into, one media outlet and not another. And in a sense, the government already funds the production of some news through the ABC and SBS. And then we have the question of whether digital platforms should contribute to the costs of news production. And I think Dan's point there is right, that these were free goods from which very large corporate players were profiting from. And the question of whether some kind of a levying on that was appropriate was, in a sense, the issue that won me over. I would just observe that I think there are different issues here between Google and Facebook, and there's also, where are other platforms in this? There's Twitter, there's LinkedIn and so forth. But I think there's a difference in the news space between search and social. That a social media world where news is a very minor part of it is entirely envisageable. TikTok is not particularly a news space, for instance, but a search, the nature of search, it is public infrastructure in the digital economy, and it has to carry news. And I think Google, in that respect, Google played a much longer game than Facebook on this, which I think is a sign of a company that has a quite different corporate culture and preparedness to deal with governments, whereas Facebook has a history of threatening to walk out of jurisdictions that introduce any regulation that impacts on its.
I'd agree with that, Terry. I think Facebook is somewhat less mature than Google in terms of lobbying government, and that's been evidenced on countless occasions. One thing I want to ask you though is, like, we've been talking about tax and transfer here as an alternative. Like, I feel like there's some depressing ideas about what's possible in this space in terms of taking on these behemoths. And one of the obvious ways I think you could have undercut some of the concerns that Peter has about lack of transparency is about just taxing these platforms and then putting that money into journalism in a variety of different ways. Like, Terry, you're at a university, huge amounts of university research is funded by government at an arm's length, in an arm's length manner. I mean, there's problems with that as well, but I have no understanding as to why journalism can't have a similar model of some description. And I just feel like there's a real absence of ambition here. There's always this assumption that because advertising has funded journalism since day dot, that's what's going to be the future as well. And that then this is a leaning into a data extractive business model that essentially we're not going to resist data extraction by platforms. That is part of their business model that we endorse. In fact, we're getting into bed with them. Now, I'm not saying Dan says that, but I do think that advocates of the code essentially were saying that. Why couldn't we have a system whereby we centralise a revenue tax on revenue for digital platforms like France has experimented with, put that into a source of funds that is then tapped into for various journalism projects? What's wrong with that? Why it seems to work out okay for academics, even when they're doing research that's critical of government. Couldn't the same be true of journalism?
Possibly. I mean, you get to the pros and cons. I'm not sure the Australian Research Council is in a particularly robust state right at the minute, being in the sector. And I think about, a lot of debates come up with the Australia Council as a mechanism for funding. You can up to a point, but I think perhaps the virtue of the news media bargaining code in that respect is it makes it very clear who are the bargaining parties in this. Whereas I think, and I'm not saying it precludes government schemes or different ways of taxing digital platforms. I think all of those things are in the mix.
You're for big tax and transfer, Terry.
Yeah, but I mean, as soon as you get into government funding, you get, first of all, the questions of, well, why would you fund a news outlet and not a new hospital, and all those sorts of perennial debates. And secondly, and there is some evidence of this in Europe, when you get direct government funding of news providers, there are real risks of political interference all the way down the line.
Can I jump in with a couple of comments on your points as well, Lizzie, if I could? I'm a little bit on the fence, to be honest, about the tax and sort of transfer option. I think it does have merit in some ways, but I'm just nervous about the idea of us taking funding from the government in any way. I think that journalism plays a role as someone who's often attacking the government in a way that perhaps universities aren't. So I think it is potentially more problematic. Although I haven't thought this through. Perhaps that's obvious. Can I just come back to your other point though on advertising? I think that I think they're two separate issues. I think that just because we are asking for payment for the benefit or receive payment for the benefit that the platforms receive from our content and they are advertising businesses doesn't change the fact that we still need to have privacy reform. And those are two distinct things. And if we had privacy reform, which did its job, you could have both Google and Facebook, and I hope we get to this point, you can have both Google and Facebook paying for the benefit they receive from our journalism, which they are now doing. And you can have privacy reform, which significantly restricts the surveillance tactics, if you like, or strategy that underpins a lot of digital advertising. Both of those things are possible. It's an and, not an or. So
it can also involve making them pay tax. Like just because they're paying a market accommodation for their monopoly power doesn't mean they shouldn't be paying tax either. And the broader piece about them hiving off their profits through a license to a tax haven, that's a global challenge that needs to be addressed. Sure. But they're taking the piss out of the world, really, aren't they? Mm. Is that a technical term?
but it's a fair point. Like it's a fair point. Like I completely understand, by the way, Lizzie, your concern around does this deal potentially entrench some of these practices? I guess it does if we don't do anything else. But if we actually reform privacy, as well as some of the things that Pete's talking about, tax reform and everything else, then hopefully we can all of these areas can improve.
And this goes back to the other problem with the bargaining code, was that it was one of 23 recommendations, another which was digital literacy, another one which was privacy, another one which was disinformation, another one that was ad tech. So, and Lizzie and everyone was rightly cynical that this was the one at the head of the queue, as if it was a cure-all, because it was the one that put money, not just in Guardian's pockets, but in Murdoch and Costello's. So we are right to be cynical about this process. And until the rest of that inquiry and its recommendations are moved on, that cynicism will remain.
Yeah, I mean, it's hilarious to be advocating for digital literacy education when, Sky News is a source of disinformation, which is now a key provider of supposedly quality news in this country. I mean, the other thing that I hate about this is that it is privatized in the sense that why has the government vacated the space in terms of being a provider of infrastructure of social engagement in online spaces? I mean, this is Pete's big hobby horse. I think he's putting up his hand for a reason.
The air conditioning on.
Okay, he's turning the air conditioning on. Fine, he's not got any new ideas. But the point, of course, is that government should be investing in building infrastructure so that people don't have to be by default dependent on Facebook as a place to, make friends with your neighbours in the street, to, set up mutual aid societies in the course of a lockdown during a pandemic, to share news and local content that if you're in a regional or rural area, like the government should be investing in this. So there's multiple layers in which that big fund for journalism might work. It might subsidise cadetships in journalism, but it might also subsidise the infrastructure to be able to distribute quality content, and also then ultimately facilitate what I would like to see, online community building that isn't subject to corporate surveillance. And that's another form of governance that I think partly this code just kind of displaces all that discussion. It's like not even on the agenda. And I think there's potential problems with that. Pete's thought about this a lot more than me, but there's things that we have to be careful about. But I also think, just not discussing that seems like, we've given Scott Morrison a free kick. He just doesn't have to do anything about this. Doesn't have to think about what society might look like in 5 years' time and start investing in the infrastructure necessary to get there. And that seems like a terrible shame to me.
I think one of the big issues around the future of news that is not addressed by this code is the future of local and regional news. And really we've seen, the news deserts phenomenon. We've seen a kind of implosion of, non-national, non-metropolitan news sites around the country, and I think it comes back to bite. I mean, and the limits of the sort of the subscription model in the US are very apparent, that you can build strong brand platforms on the East Coast and the West Coast of the US, but in the rest of the country, the news system is collapsing. And
Terry, I think I can give you some insight into why this happens, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you, but just on this one point, just for everyone's benefit. So the Guardian is about 60% of our revenue now comes from our readers, so from voluntary contributions mostly, but I mean, you can put them in the same category as subscriptions in a way. 40% from advertising. The problem with these regional mastheads is just the economics don't stack up. So even the most successful of us are only signing up about 2 to 3% of our audience to become a subscriber of our publications. And if you're only getting 2 to 3% of a town which has 50,000 people in it, you can't run a business. You just can't. It's impossible to build something of substance. And the other problem is that because digital advertising has become so much about targeting, you can't really run an advertising business in those markets either, unless it's in the classified space, which some are having success with. So it's a really difficult problem and hard to solve. I don't have the answers there, unfortunately. Probably that's a bit depressing, but that's the reality.
I mean,
we're winding. Any final thoughts? I did pose the question in my Guardian piece whether we are eating chocolate mud cake or something else altogether. But it does feel like it's been great to spend a bit of time just marking what was a global moment. So I'm so glad that the Guardian is a stronger company than it was. I am so disappointed that we don't quite know how that benefit has actually rolled out, and I'm really looking forward to the 12-month review to see if we can find out anything more about it. But before we finish up, Lizzie, anything to announce for Digital Rights Watch members or fans over the coming weeks?
I was just going to say that every year Digital Rights Watch gathers together activists, writers and critical thinkers to reflect on the major digital rights initiatives or events that have occurred over the last 12 months. And so we call that the State of Digital Rights Report. We've got a date for its launch and its publication on the 3rd of March. So it's the Thursday before the next one of these. So if you're interested in coming along, you don't know about it, you can sign up to our email list and you can get an invite, but you can register and it'd be great to see you there. Excellent. We'll circulate that amongst our list. Thanks, Lizzie. Dan, just more work at the grindstone at Guardian?
Well, actually, I do have something which I can't say the whole thing yet because we haven't quite announced it, but I will make another point which is relevant to this conversation, actually. We are, in fact, about to substantially increase our local reporting in a few key areas. And we're doing that, by the way, with the help of some of the funds that we received from the platforms. So we're going to areas that we couldn't, as I said before, just aren't economic on their own. But with the help of some of this funding, not just this, but with the help of some of it. Come on, can you tell us what it is? What are you talking about? Come on. We're going to be doing more local reporting. That's about as much as I can say at this stage. But in about 2 weeks' time, or like perhaps next one, I'll be able to tell all of you about it. I'm sure it will make your day, Lizzie. Great.
Hey, and Terry, thanks a lot for being part of this. Terry's got, and we'll circulate it later, I think you got a new paper out looking at some of this, and obviously regular commentator on the issue. So guys, have a great weekend. It's almost time to think about winding it up, and we'll see you in a fortnight. Thanks for being part of Burning Platforms today. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, folks.
Stay around for a sec if you like. I'm very, very poor at clearing the room, but see you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Special thanks to Dean and Dylan for facing off in the chat room. That was outstanding. Love it. Yeah.
Just